All right, Jabosai, good morning. Let's begin. So today's daf is Nun Dalid. Our shir this morning is sponsored by David Kahana in memory of his father-in-law Zev ben Shlomo. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, the Neshama will have an aliyah, and also in the merit of Rabbi Sonnenshine's mother, Charna Tova Bas Rachel Leah. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, she has a complete refuah. All right, so we'll say a lot to do today. We left off by the Gemara. On today's daf is Nun Dalet, as I mentioned before, 54. We left off by the Gemara on Nun Gimel Amud Beis. Says the Gemara, Maya Filu. So remember again, the Gemara was talking about the idea that essentially Yibum is effect. Oh, and a very special thank you to Ken Krieger for the herring. A new addition to in honor of the birth of his granddaughter. Baruch Hashem, you should be zocha legadla letorah lechuppah lemasim tovim. And the rest of the breakfast. Shkoach to Ari Lerner for the mezonos, for the cookies, for the ragalach. Thank you very much. You should be zocha to provide cookies and ragalach ad mea ve'esrim shanim tovos. All right. Yeah, amen. Okay, so let's begin. So remember again, the Mishnah we spoke about was talking about the idea that essentially Yibum is affected through Biyah, irregardless of the intent of the parties, whether or not there's a kavana ultimately for Yibum, or there's a kavana for Znus, or there's a kavana or no kavana at all. The Maisa, again, Yibum is affected. So remember again, the Lashon of the Gemara was, the Lashon of the Mishnah was, Habayi vinto bein b'shogeg bein b'mezid, bein ba'onis bein baratzon. So whether one has relations with the Yevama, shogeg, mezid, onis, ratzon, afilu hu shogeg v'hi mezid, even if he is a shogeg. Now, remember, we spoke about the case of shogeg. What was shogeg? The shogeg was that he did not realize that this woman was the Yevama. He thought perhaps she was his wife, or for that matter, some other woman, but did not know that she was the Yevama. Says the Gemara, my afilu. What is that lashon of afilu? Says the Gemara, lomi boy kamar, lomi boy who shogeg v'hi kamachavna lemitzvah. So it goes without saying that if he's a shogeg, meaning he doesn't realize that this woman is the Yevama, but she, the Yevama, has intention for the mitzvah. Inami, or who mezid v'hi kamachavna lemitzvah, or he's mezid. What was the case of mezid? Mezid is he knows who she is, but he has intentions again to have relations with her for the sake of just having relations, not for the sake of affecting mitzvah, but she has in mind for the mitzvah. So we'll say, in those cases, I would say it's obvious that Yibum is affected. Why is it obvious that Yibum is affected? Because at least one of the two parties has in mind to affect Yibum. Rather, what's the chiddush of the Mishnah? Ela afilu hu shogeg v'hi mezida. Rather, the chiddush of the Mishnah is that even if he's a shogeg, meaning shogeg that he thinks that perhaps she's a different woman, that again, he does not think that she is the Yevama, he thinks it's his wife or someone else, v'hi mezida, and her intention is not for Yibum, rather again, her intention is for the sake of Znus. In that case, neither has intent to affect Yibum. Nevertheless, afilu hachikana. Nevertheless, what's Rabbi say? Nevertheless, Yibum is affected. So the Gemara will say that's the chiddush of the Mishnah. So the chiddush of the Mishnah is even if neither of them have in mind to affect the mitzvah of Yibum, essentially the message of the Mishnah is biyah, and goes ahead and affects the Yibum irrespective of the intent of the parties. Tani Rabbi Chia. Rabbi Chia said, "Afilu shneim shogegim, shnehem mezidim, shneim anusim," and that Rabbi Chia says this more explicitly. Rabbi Chia, when he taught this Mishnah, taught the ruling in the following: even if both of them are shogeg, even if both of them are mezid, even if both of them are anusim. Rabbi say ones means literally against their will. So we'll define that in just a moment. So Rabbi Chia's point is that even if both of them lack proper intent for Yibum, nevertheless, as long as a biyah occurred, Yibum is affected. Says the Gemara, Anus temas nisin hechidami. What exactly is the case of Anus? Right? What is this case? Ultimately, I understand how Anus could take place for the woman. I understand ultimately again how the biyah could be against her will, but what's the case of Anus in the man's perspective? Anus temas nisin hechidami. If you say that it's when, let's say, Ovdei Kochavim, idolaters, forced him to engage in the act of intimacy, Ubala, and as he had relations with her as a result of being compelled, says the Gemara, Rava said, can't happen, Ein ones le'erva, there is no such thing as being compelled to engage in illicit relations. Just from the man's perspective. Why? She'ein kishui ela ladas, because the Bible says, since engaging in An act of relations requires arousal, and arousal could only occur if a person has intent for that. Therefore, there's no such thing as being forced to perform. Now, again, remember, this is from the man's perspective. Obviously, from the woman's perspective, it absolutely could happen against her will. But from the male perspective, the Gemara is suggesting, how can you have a case of ones? How can you force a man to engage in an act of immorality, where by definition, to engage in that act requires his intent? Says the Gemara. Ela b'yashin. This is interesting. The Gemara says, rather, it's talking about a case where he was sleeping. Rashi says, Ela b'yashin, sheniskasha kishu yashin. He's in a state of arousal while he's sleeping, and therefore, again, while he's sleeping, ultimately the Yevama has relations with him. So the Gemara says, V'hamar Rav Yehuda. Rav Yehuda said, Yashin lo kana b'yevimto. But the Gemara says, but we said before, we've said elsewhere, Rav Yehuda said that if a man is sleeping, even if he is in a state of arousal and it affects bia in that state, lemaisa, again, yibum, that's not yibum. So the Gemara says, Ella beniska. I would say, okay, so this is an interesting case. Rashi says, beniska, sheniskasha li ishto, v'nafal minagag, v'niska biyavimto, that he was preparing, look, accidents happen, right? He was preparing for relations with his wife. He was aroused for his wife. Ultimately, again, he fell off the roof and ended up having relations with the Yevama. Now, I will say, now understand, whenever the Gemara gives in, like as I always tell you, don't get hung, because you're thinking, like, where did that happen exactly? Remember, don't get caught up in that. The point the Gemara is making over here is that there was arousal, because arousal, again, was for something permitted, but yet, again, when it came to the actual act, the act itself, again, occurred with the Yevama.
What about Lot?
I'm sorry?
What about Lot and his daughters? Didn't they, he wasn't intending to have relations with his daughters.
He was drunk.
Yeah.
Can't be honest.
Yeah.
Can't be honest.
Yeah, he was drunk. So we'll see. Drunkenness is a different. We'll talk about Rambam. We'll talk about drunkenness. So the Gemara says over here like this. So therefore, again, the case the Gemara is giving is what's the case of ones. So the Gemara is labeling this as a case of ones. Remember, so there's the kishrei, there's the arousal for the purpose of his wife, but ultimately, again, the fact that the act of relations ends up happening with the Yevama, ultimately, again, is considered to be an ones. So the Gemara says, V'hamar Rabba said, Nafal minagag v'niska. If a man falls off the roof and he ends up having relations with the Yevama, chayiv ba'arba'a dvarim. He is chayiv for four things. And I will say, what are those four things? That's talking about damages. If you look at Rashi, chayiv b'dal dvarim, b'nezek tsar ripui boshes, or v'sheves, excuse me. So the Gemara says, Rabbi say, nezek is damages, tsar is pain and suffering, ripui is medical bills, sheves is lost wages. So if a man falls down and ultimately, again, off the roof and ends up having relations with the Yevama, he's chayiv for damaging her in four ways. However, ubiyavimto lokana, but it does not affect yibum. Remember, we're trying to figure out the case over here of where a man could be an ones and yet still affect yibum. Rather, it must be a case where, again, his kavana was for the isha, therefore, again, his arousal was for his wife. And what happens? And the Yevama grabs him and has relations with him. So therefore, again, lemaisa, the arousal was there because he was preparing for a permitted act. The Yevama grabbed him and had relations with him. So the Gemara says, in that case, so that could be a case where lemaisa, again, there is a situation of ones, where again the kavana, remember he was prepared for relations, permitted relations, then before he was able to engage in that act, the Yevama had relations with him. So the Gemara says, Shnei anusim dibirei b'chiyah heichidami. What's the case of where both of them are anusim? That was taught in the yeshiva of Rabbi Chia. Kigon sheniskavin liishto, where again he had kavana for his wife, utekafuhu ovdei kochavim, and again he was seized by people, by ovdei kochavim, v'davkum zeba ze uba'aleha, and literally again he put the yavam together with the Yevama, and ultimately they had relations like that. So we'll say that would be a case. So if you see the common denominator over here, is that in all of these cases there was arousal for the purpose of a permitted act, and then that act is interrupted, and ultimately again the bia with the Yevama occurs. So that would be the case where again there would be the kishui, there'd be the arousal, but lamaisa again it's still considered to be ones. So the Gemara says, Mina hani mili. From where do we know this from? From where do we know this from? The Tanur Rabbanon, because we learned Yevama Yava Aleha mitzvah. So I will say, because the pasuk says Yevama Yava Aleha, that the Yevama shall have relations with her. Meaning, what we're trying to ask over here is like this: the Mishnah put forward a principle, which is that as long as bia occurs, yibum has been affected. Yibum's been affected. Even if no one has intention for Yibum, even more than that, even if people have intention ultimately, again, for illicit relations, nevertheless, Yibum has been affected. The Gemara says, how do we know that? Where do we know that from? To which the Gemara answers, Yevamo Yava Aleha, because the Pasuk says, the Yevama, which again, this case over here, Yevamo Yava Aleha, refers to the Yavam, to the surviving brother, shall have relations again with the widow, and that affects Yibum. So the fact that it just says relations affect Yibum indicates to us that even if those relations are not necessarily done for the right purposes, Lemais, it still affects Yibum. So the Gemara says, Davar Acher, another possibility is Yevamo Yava Aleha. What does it mean, Yevamo Yava Aleha? Bein b'shogeg, bein b'mezid, bein ba'onis, bein b'ratzon. So again, first of all, I'm sorry, let me read that differently. So Yevamo Yava Aleha, when the Gemara says mitzvah, what mitzvah means, if you look at Rashi says, the first thing the Torah is teaching us is that Yibum is preferable over Chalitza. Yevamo Yava Aleha, we prefer Yibum over Chalitza. Then the Gemara says, another thing we learn out from this pasuk is what? Yevamo Yava Aleha, that as long as Bia occurs, bein b'shogeg, bein b'mezid, intentional, unintentional, ones, ratzon, against his will, or against his will, her will, or again with their intentions, halacha l'maisi Yibum works. I think, one second. Here's the problem. We just used the same phrase for two different drashos. So Yevamo Yava Aleha, you told me that means what? Number one, what does it mean? It's a mitzvah for Yibum more than Chalitza. And then you told me Yevamo Yava Aleha, that Bia works no matter what. Now you can't do that. You can't do that. If you're going to use the drasha to teach me that what? That Lamaisa, it's a mitzvah to do Yibum more than Chalitza, then the drush is taken. Then you can't subsequently go ahead and use that for something else. To which the Gemara says, no, I'll tell you, the mitzvah, meve'im lo yachbotza ish nafka. The fact that Yibum is a mitzvah over Chalitza, that we learn out from the phrase of Im lo yachbotza ish, if the man will choose not to take her. And I will say the fact that the pasuk says that the man will choose not to take her indicates to us what? That the primary desire is to have him do Yibum. It's only if he doesn't want to do Yibum that there's a thing called Chalitza. If that's the case, then it frees up that drasha of Yevamo Yava Aleha to teach us that Bia is Kona no matter what the circumstances of the Bia. The Gemara says, Ha chavatz yavam v'chi asakra bein b'shogeg bein b'mezid bein ba'onis bein b'ratzon, and therefore that frees out the pasuk Yevamo Yava Aleha to teach me that ultimately again Bia will occur. Bia can affect Yibum no matter what the circumstances. Tanya Idach, we have another brayso that supports this. Yevamo Yava Aleha kidarka. I will say when the pasuk says Yevamo Yava Aleha, that the Yevam will have relations with her, kidarka. Ultimately that means Bia kidarka, normal Bia. V'lakcha, and what does it mean when it says v'lakcha? Shelo kidarka. That refers to Bia shelo kidarka, that you can affect Yibum both with Bia kidarka and Bia shelo kidarka. Via bein. And furthermore, again, it says V'yavam Bia Gomeresba Ve'in Kesef Ushtar Gomrimba. So what does V'yavim teach us? That only Bia affects Yibum and Kesef and Shtar do not. And I both say, remember, even though we said before that what? We said before that Lemaisa, there's the concept of Ma'amar, and we saw even the Rambam said that you should do Ma'amar, but Ma'amar, Kesef, or Shtar will not go ahead and affect Yibum, only Bia affects Yibum. So the Gemara says, V'yibma, what does it mean when it says V'yibma? Bal Karcha. That means that even if he has relations with the Yevama against her will, it still affects Yibum. Davar Acher, another possibility is Yevama Yava Aleha, Bein B'shogeg. Remember again, Yevama Yava Aleha means that no matter how the Bia occurs, Lemais Yibum has been affected. But one second, we just say now we're using the same phrase for multiple drushos. You just told me before that Yevamo Yava Aleha teaches me that Bia Kedarka is Kona. Now you're telling me that Yevamo Yava Aleha means what? That if Bia occurs, no matter what the nature of the Bia, Ones, Ratzon, Shogeg, Mezid, it works. So what's going on over here? To which the Gemara says, Hahu Melahakim. How do we learn out that Bia Kedarka is Kona? Hahu Melahakim La'achev Shem. Nafka. We learn out from that phrase that what's the point of Yibum? To establish a name for his brother through offspring. B'makom shemakim shem v'chmakom shakim shem. That ultimately, again, from the place from where from the place from where the name for his brother will be established, i.e., speaking about the birth of a child, from that place from where the child is born, that is the place ultimately, again, where Yibum could be affected as well, i.e., Bia Kedarko. V'chi asakra, bein b'shogeg, bein b'mezid, bein ba'ones, bein b'ratzon. And therefore, again, the phrase of lahakim, the phrase of Yevamo Yavo Aleha, that could teach us that Bia, no matter what kind of Bia, no matter what the circumstances of the Bia, has the ability to go ahead and affect Yibum. Says the Gemara Gufa. The Gemara Gufa also goes back to something we said before. Amar Yehuda, Yashen lo kana be'ivimto. If the Yavam is sleeping, he cannot affect Yibum with the Yavama in that state. Meaning, again, let's say he's in a state of arousal in his sleep, and the Yavama has relations with him, that does not go ahead and affect Yibum. Do Amakra, because the pasuk says, Yavama yavo aleha. Because the both say, here's what's interesting, is that even if you want to say that Lemaisa, you don't need to have intention for Yibum, you definitely need to have intention for what? You need to have intention for the Bia. Therefore, Lemaisa, if he doesn't have intention for the Bia, like in a case, ultimately, of where he's sleeping, which will also come to the drunk case as well, if he doesn't have intention for the Bia, then Lemaisa, again, he cannot affect Yibum. V'atanya, but we learned, Bein Er, Bein Yashin, but we learned that he could affect Bia, whether he's asleep or awake or asleep. Ema, Bein Ara, Bein Yashana. No, rather change that from the masculine to the feminine to say that Bia could be affected how? Whether she is awake or she is asleep. Because also remember, after we've already established that technically speaking, Yibum could go ahead and occur even against her will, whether that Bia occurs when she's awake or when she's asleep. Either way, Yibum is affected. I v'hatanya bein erhu bein yashenhu. But in second, we learned that whether he is awake or he is asleep, Yibum could be affected. It's clearly talking about the man. To which the Gemara says, no, you have to change it. Bein arahi, bein yashenahi. So we'll say again, what we're talking about over here is you have to once again change it to the feminine. So which the Gemara says, so what's the case where it seemed to indicate that he could affect Yibum even when he's sleeping? B'misnamneim. So we'll say, what does misnamneim mean? Misnamneim means, often it's translated as daydreaming. Probably better is talking about dozing, right? Where a person is kind of asleep but not really asleep. So if he were to have relations with the Yevama at that time, apparently again that would affect Yibum. To which the Gemara says, Heichidami misnamneim. What exactly is the state of misnamneim? Amravashi nim velo nim tir velo tir. He's kind of asleep but not asleep, awake but not awake. Most people spend most of the day in this state, actually, right? So misnamneim kigon dikari le va'ani. If you ask him a question, he could answer it, right? So meaning, if you ask somebody something, they'll snap out of their days and they'll answer it. However, velo yada la dure svara. If you ask them yes/no questions, they'll answer. But they can't. I will say this is kind of. Everything said in this year stays in this year. This is kind of like those late night conversations where your wife starts asking you all these different questions, like deep questions. If it's yes, no, I can absolutely answer it. If it requires any level of deeper thought, I'm out, right? So he knows how to answer yes or no. But again, he doesn't know how to answer with logic. But if you remind him of something, then he'll remember it. So apparently what the Gemara is saying is like this. When the Bryce has said that a man could affect Yibum even if he's sleeping, so again, it doesn't really mean sleeping. What it means is kind of like that daydreaming type of dozing, where he's in and out, but he's aware. V'harai, if you ask him a question, a yes-no question, he'll answer it. So in that state, there is enough of an awareness to assume that he knows what's happening with the Bia, and therefore if he were to affect Bia in that state, then Lamaisa, again, the Bia would be affected. But should he be mamish asleep, Lamaisa, again, such a Bia would not work. Gufa, Amarabba, Nafal Minagag Viniska, Chaye Barba, Dvarim, Ubiyavimta Lokana. So remember, going back to what we said before, the man is on the roof. The man is on the roof in a state of arousal, and what happens? He falls off, and he falls into the Yevama. He is chayiv for 4 things. However, again, he has not acquired the Yevama. What are the 4 things? Nezek, tsar, sheves, ripui, damages, pain and suffering, lost wages, and medical bills. Interestingly enough, aval boshes lo mechayer. This is actually very interesting. You are not chayiv for humiliation. Generally, when you damage someone, there's a category. I don't know if there's a legal equivalent of this. Maybe this is included under pain and suffering. Right? Under pain and suffering. So interestingly enough, in halacha, pain and suffering is reckoned separately from humiliation. Humiliation, Boshas also says, is very interesting because obviously that is a very subjective category. Depending on your social standing, depending on your societal standing, your Boshas is relative. So interesting enough, the Gemara says that there's the 4 categories of damages, but yet you're not chayiv for Boshas. Do Amar Mar, ein chayiv ala Boshas ad she is kaveh. Because it was a paskin halacha lemaisa that you are only chayiv for boshes if what? If you intentionally damage. Now remember, you're chayiv for all of the other damages, even if you unintentionally damage. But for boshes, you're only chayiv for that if you intentionally damage. Amar Rava. Rava said, "Niskavim lahatiach bakosel v'yatiach b'yevimtov." So we'll say again, this is another interesting case. The case over here is where literally his kavana is to lahatiach literally means to press against the wall. So it seems to be he's trying to gratify himself in some fashion by pressing against the wall. He's in a state of arousal as a result. V'yatiach b'yevimto, but he ends up having relations with the yevama. Okay, I will say again. Remember, you don't have to start worrying about how this actually happens, because the point over here, remember, is the point the Gemara is making is like this about what the kavana is. So remember, in this case over here, he didn't have a kavana for bia. He had a kavana up to press against the wall, and he ended up having bia with the yevama.
This is odd because it's literally giving a man an excuse to not have to pay for certain things, for like an embarrassment. You could just say, I never had kavana to do that. I had kavana for against the wall, but really,
No. This is a different case. This is not a case of damages anymore. This is now we've done with damages. Damages was a case where he fell onto her from the rooftop. This is now just a case of bia. The shaila is, does this affect yibum or not? So the Gemara is saying over here, if his intention was to press against the wall and he ended up again pressing into her, so lo kana, that does not work. However, latiach bebehima, if he had intention for bestiality, right? He had I know this is a lot happening in one day. I should have put out the email, with the age limits on the. Michael, I'm sorry. I'm trying to be as nondescript as possible. I promise. So Mr. Martyr, if you can give them more candy, just to. There's a little bit of a distraction over here. So says the Gemara over here like this. So what happens if he had kavana for bestiality, latiach bebehema, v'atiach b'yevama, and ultimately again then he had relations with the yevama. Then Abba say what kana? Then that works. Why? Dahakamechadim l'shem bia ba'olam. So also, it's coming out of here something very interesting, which is that lemais in the case of the wall, so there's no kavana for bia. If there's no kavana for bia, the fact that it results in bia with the yevama, so that is not going to affect yibum. In the case of the bestiality, lemais again, it's aser. Obviously it's a chi of misa, but it's still at least halachically, it's called that one is having kavana for an act of bia. So because one is having kavana for an act of bia, Reuven had intention for the cow, but it ended up being the yevama. So the mice again, that's still called kavana for bia, and therefore again the mice it would still work. Echad ha'ma'ara. So we'll say now the Gemara explains that. Remember, in the Mishnah said ma'ara. Now ma'ara, we're going to discuss this. Baruch Hashem, not today, but we are going to get into this in terms of what the actual technical definition of this is. But here's what we know it means for now. What it means for our purposes for today is that lamais, it's not a full bia. It's not a full bia. Only what we'll call a partial bia. Only a little bit of contact between the man and the woman. A partial insertion. So again, we haven't defined the scope of that yet. So that we'll discuss in Meretz Hashem in the coming days. So the Gemara, the point the Gemara is making over here, what is what Rabbi say, that you don't need a complete bia to affect yibum. Says the Gemara, Amar Ula, Minay la'ara min Torah. How do we know that ha'ara, this even partial insertion, goes ahead and works? Now, when we say works, by the way, works is relative. Works means that it works to affect yibum. But what it also means is that if you only had this ha'ara with a woman who is asura to you, that would still be an act of illicit relation. So remember, what quote unquote works well for yibum ultimately again has the detrimental effect in the realm of illicit relations. So how do we know that ha'ara, how do we know that this concept, this partial insertion, ultimately is significant enough in the world of relations? How do we know that it affects relations? Shneimar, v'ish asher yishkav es isha. Dava, v'gilas ervasa, v'es mikora ha'ara. Because the pasuk says, The pasuk says literally that if a man will go ahead and lay with a woman, dava literally means afflicted. Vigilas ervasa, he will reveal her erva as mikora ha'era, and her source be'era will say literally means bared. So obviously, again, the Torah is talking in terms of relations here. The idea the Gemara is picking up on is the Torah Dafka uses the lashon of ha'ara, which again, although in this context actually means bared, but also again means some level of contact. Mikan leha'ara min Torah. From here, you see that ha'ara, that this partial insertion goes ahead and affects bia on a biblical level. So the Gemara says, Ashkecha nida. Now we'll say this pasuk over here is talking about a woman who's a nida. So the Torah is telling me, according to the Gemara is telling me, is that even a partial insertion with a woman who is a nida, ultimately, again, now obviously relations with a nida is an isser karis, will go ahead and create a karis bearing prohibition. Okay, that's fine by nida. I understand that by nida. How do I know shar rayos minayin? How do I know that this applies to other acts of arayos as well, meaning other forbidden women? Maybe you'll say, well, let's just learn out everything from nida. If it's true by nida, it should be true by everyone. To which the Gemara says it can't necessarily be true. Mali nida shekei mitames bala. Nida is different because you know what happens with nida when a man has relations with a nida. Not only is there an isser for the act of bia, but what? The man himself becomes tameh. Her status devolves upon him, which of course is a very unique idea. So maybe nida can serve as the paradigmatic example for the fact that ha'ara, that even again this partial bia could go ahead and actually count as full bia. Ella asya me eshes ach. Rather, we learn it out from eshes ach. I both say from the wife of one's brother. Dichsiv v'isha shayikach es eshes achiv nida he. The pasuk says if a man will take his brother's wife, she is a nida to him. Now, what does that mean? V'chi eshes achiv the olam nida he. Now, what does that mean if it calls my brother's wife a nida? She's always a nida. So the Gemara says ella kinida. Rather, what the Torah is saying is my brother's wife has the status of a nida to me. Man nida b'ha'ara. Just like again the nida, one violates the prohibition of relations with the nida, just with hara, af eshes ach bahara. So too again, eshes ach also is usher even with just this partial bia. So we'll say, so now what we have is we have nida, we have eshes ach. But the Gemara says, 1 second. Mali eshes ach shekim biyado l'rabos. Now eshes ach, rabosai, is an interesting prohibition. Why? Because my brother has the ability to add on as many women in this isser to me as possible. Why? Di'i by mekadesh va'azal ki alpa, he can marry 1,000 women, and if he marries 1,000 women, then what? Each of those women are considered to be my eshes ach. So what the Gemara is pointing out over here, we're looking for a paradigm. In order to be a paradigm, you can't have any peculiar, unique aspects. Eshes ach is interesting. Why? Because my brother controls the nature of that isser towards me. That should he want to marry 1,000 women, each of those women become asura to me. Ela asya me achos av va'achos im. Rather, where do we learn it out from? We learn it out from the prohibition of my father's sister and my mother's sister. That both of those people are asura to me. Because the pasuk says, "Tichsiv ve'ervas achos imcha va'achos avicha lo sigala." Because the pasuk says, literally, the erva, the nakedness of your achos imcha, of your mother's sister, and of your father's sister, you shall not reveal. Ki es she'ira ha'era. Why? Because the pasuk says, because literally your relative hera, that same lashon of bearing. So we'll say, so once we see now again, so what's going to be the limud? The limud is, it says over here hera, and it says by nida hera, just like by nida again hara, only the partial bia, even the partial bia goes ahead and creates the isser. So too over here, it'll also create the isser. And I will say, once I show that is true by my father's sister, my mother's sister, then it'll be true by what? All other arayos as well. To which the Gemara says, no, ikal mifrach, you could raise a pircha. What's the pircha? Mala achos av va'achos aim, shekain isser haba me'elav. But I will say, in the case of achos av, in the case of achos aim, these, the father's brother, father's mother, father's sister and mother's sister, these are also what we call, these are isser haba me'elav. Now, isser haba me'elav means what? These are isurim that occur on their own. Meaning that there's nothing that has to happen to create these isurim. These are isurim that are like de facto isurim. However, again, therefore, I'm going to say maybe that only applies to isurim that are de facto isurim, but other isurim that are not de facto isurim that become isurim because of decisions that people make, ultimately, again, perhaps would not be subject to the hara issue. The Gemara says. I'm sorry, mechadelo asya. Therefore, Abba say it could be that we can't learn out this idea that ha'ara, that partial bia is aser from any one of these sources, but rather elatesi mitarti. Rather, we should learn it out from two of the sources. So the Gemara says, okay, which two should we use? Remember, we have three now, right? We have number one, nida, number two, brother's wife, and number three, father's sister, mother's sister. So which should we learn it out from? Maybe I'll learn it out from the case of my brother's wife and my father's sister. Remember, father, sister, mother, sister go together. I could say in those cases, those people are usher because they are related to me, and therefore maybe the issue of hara partial bia is only a problem where the erva is related to me. Ella tisi minida, but rather let's learn it out from nida. Learn it out from nida, and the case of father, sister, mother, sister. To which the Gemara says, no, those are isurim. That's what that are created on their own. Ella tisi minida ve'eshes ach. Maybe I'll learn it out from the case of nida and eshes ach demai pirchas, because there you can't really ask anything on those two cases. So we'll say, so it would appear over here that it's a two-pronged limud. I learned it out from nida and I learned it out from eshes ach. That lamaisa, even hara, even this partial bia will ultimately again create an isra. And once it's true in those two cases, then by definition it will be true in all other cases of erva as well. So the Gemara says, Maskif Rav Achabri Dravika. So Rav Achabri Dravika is the kasha. Malini de ve'eshas ach shkin elam heter b'chai osran. Now there is a pircha, because in the case of eshes ach, in the case of nida, that there is no heter b'chai osran, which literally means we're gonna have to define exactly what this means. That as long as they are alive, the isser is in existence. We'll define what that means in just a moment. Tomar be'eshes ish shekein yesh la heter b'chai osra. It's not true. So if a married woman, let's say, does have a heter, even in the lifetime of the man who prohibited her, how? Meaning who prohibits her? It's her husband. How could she be released from that isser? Get. Right? Divorce. One second, Ravina. Atu nida ve'eshes ach bechai ostron hu de'elam heter vala achar mikan yeshlam heter. Are you trying to tell me that a nida and a eshes ach only have a heter? While let me say differently. The only ashes. Let me read that again. Atu nida ve'eshes ach bechai ostron hu de'elam heter. Are you trying to tell me that nida and ashes ach, while the entity that asered them is alive or is in existence, they don't have heter. Avala achar mikan yeshlam heter. I will say what the Gemara is asking is like this: ashes ach, I understand, but nida. What do you mean that she's always in a state of iser? The Gemara says nida. I'm a base. Nida biyome talya milsa. Eishesach, bebanim talya milsa. So the Gemara says, bebanim talya rachmana. The Gemara says, what are you talking about? A nida ultimately again is only nida for a certain amount of days. Eishesach rabosai is only going to be usher when bebanim. Rabosai. Now, what does that mean? Remember, we know that if my brother is married to a woman, even if he divorces her, she is still asura to me. The only time she becomes permitted is when. If he dies with no children, meaning even if he dies, the woman is still asura. It's only if he dies without children. Ela parachachi. Rather, this here you have to ask. Ma lenida ve'eshes ach shekein osran matiran. So Rabbi say, here's the issue. When it comes to nida and eshes ach, ein osran matira. That which asers them cannot permit them. What does that mean? That when a woman is in nida, that there is no way out of that state until the nidos is over. Meaning, again, obviously the nidos will be over, but while she is in nida, there is no being released from that state. So too, again, while a woman is considered to be the wife of my brother, there is no release from that state as well. And again, that's true even if the brother dies, and even if the brother divorces her, assuming there are children. Lemaisa, again, there's no release from that state. state. So the point the Gemara is making over here, Abosai, is remember, in order to serve as a paradigm, you have to share similarities with all of the other cases of forbidden relationships. What the Gemara is trying to show is that perhaps Eishes Ach and Nida cannot serve as a paradigm because, again, they're unique in that when people are locked into that status, then what? They're really locked into that status. There's no way out from that particular status. Granted, the status may come to an end at a certain point in time, but if when a woman is a nida, there is no way out of that status. A woman is an eshes ach, there is no way out of that status. So perhaps they can't serve as a paradigm for the other cases. Tomar be'eshes, on the other hand, tomar be'eshes ish sha'os matira. Sirabosai, as much as when a woman is married, she's in a state of isser, but that state of isser could change in any given moment. How? He divorces her. Right, a husband always has the ability to divorce her, and he could divorce her in any moment, which means that her status as an asura could be turned off. So perhaps, again, I can't use nida, and I'm sorry. I can't use Nida and Eishes Ach as the paradigm. That hara, that partial bia, should be usher because maybe Nida and Eishes Ach have a certain stringency, namely that when they are locked into their status, they're locked in, as opposed to other cases of Isser where Lamaisa, the status is able to be changed instantly. The pasuk says, the pasuk says like this: whoever will go ahead and perform any of these abominations, v'nichrasu an nefashos ha'osos. Shabbos over here, the pasuk is referring to all of the arayos, all the forbidden relationships, and the Torah is saying that whoever goes ahead and engages in any of these forbidden relationships, they'll experience kares. So what do you see from this pasuk? Hukshu kol arayos kulun lenida. All of the forbidden relationships are compared to nida. Ma nida bahara. Shabbos, meaning once you're comparing them all together, we're saying they're all being compared to nida because this pasuk is stated in the context of nida. So they're comparing everything to nida. Ma nida bahara af kol bara. So too, just like nida, the isser comes even with a partial bia. So too, again, all other isurim also are going to be usher even with hara. The ela nida dichsiva gabe eshes achlam. So if that's the case, why did the Torah have to make mention of nida in the context of my brother's wife? To which the Gemara says, "Lichid Rafuna." In accordance to Rafuna, Dam Rafuna, because Rafuna said, "Remez Yevamos min Torah minayin." Where do we see a remez to yibum in the Torah? So the Gemara says, "Minayin haksiv Yevamo yavala." What are you talking about? Where do we find a remez to yibum? Right, the yibum is explicitly written in the Torah. It says the yavam will have relations with her. Ela remez liyevama sha'asur b'chaye baila minayin. So the answer to the Gemara says, where do we see a remez that a sister-in-law will always be asura to her brother-in-law while her husband is still alive, meaning that even if her husband divorces her, she'll still be asura to her brother-in-law. To which the Gemara says, "Hi, sorry, that seems illogic." Because the fact that the Torah has to tell me that when the brother dies, that's when she is permitted to her brother-in-law, indicates to us what? That if her husband is alive, even if not married to her, meaning they divorced, then what? She's going to be usher to her brother-in-law. The Dilma la'achar misas baila mitzvah b'chaye baila rishus. Well, maybe it's saying like this. Maybe once her husband dies, then there is a mitzvah for her to marry her brother-in-law. But let's say if her husband is alive, he divorces her, then it's not a mitzvah for the brother-in-law to marry her. But what? It's an option. It's an option. To which the Gemara says, "Inami la'achar misas baila in b'chaye baila lo." Or maybe the other possibility is that only when he dies, that is true. But again, when he's alive, the brother-in-law can't marry her. And I will be the point of that. And then, in addition to being a lav, it would also be what we call a lav haba michlal aseh. It would be a prohibition that comes as a result of a positive commandment. Therefore, Amar Kra, the pasuk says, "The ish asher yikach es eshes achiv nidahi." Therefore, the pasuk comes along and says, if a man will go ahead and take the wife of his brother, she is a nida. V'chi eshes achiv nidahi. Why does it call her a nida? Ela kinida. Ma nida afa pi sheish laheter la'achar mikan. Just like a nida will what? A nida is asura now, but later on, after she goes to the mikvah, she'll become permitted. But bishas isura kares. But again, while she's a nida, again, to have relations with her carries with it a penalty of kares. Af eshes ach. So to what? So to again the wife of a brother. Even though she'll become permitted later on. I will say, when will she become permitted later on? Right? If he dies without children, meaning even though there is a way in which she become permitted to you, nevertheless, again, while your brother is still alive, if you have relations with her, it is an Isser Kares. So I will say, again, that's the comparison between Eshes Ach and Nida. Just like Nida, she'll become permitted at some point in time, but if you have relations with her while she's in Nida, that's an Isser Kares. So too, my sister-in-law, she may become permitted to me at some point in time if my brother dies without children, but if I have relations with her now, then what? Then it's an Isser Kares. Elo, ha'ara d'ksiva be'gabe achos ava achoseim lamali. So we'll say, remember, now we're working our way back. And now what we're saying is like this. And now, tell me, why does the Torah have to state ha'ara by the king? Remember, when we say ha'ara, it means because use lashon of he'ara, he'ara, he'ayin resh he'ara, which we're learning, which we know to understand, to mean partial bia. So why does it have to state that by the case of my father's sister, my mother's sister? So the Gemara says, because remember, let's say at the end of the day, we're not using this pasuk to create the paradigm anymore. So why does it have to say it here? To which the Gemara says, because this is necessary for the conversation between Ravina and Ravav. What happened? So hama'ara b'zachar mahu. So let's say a man does ha'ara b'zachar, a partial act of mishkav zachar, a partial act with another man. What is the halacha? So the Gemara says hama'ara b'zachar mahu. Bizachar mishkavei isha ksiva. The truth is, the Torah says that the prohibition of homosexuality, it says that mishkavei isha, that I'm not permitted to go and have relations with a man, mishkavei isha, in the way that one would have relations with a woman, and therefore again, therefore what? If we've already proven that hara, that this partial bia works for a woman, then what? Then it would also be asura. It would also be asur by a man. Ella hama'ara bebehema mahu. Rather, the shaila is, let's say one has this partial bia with an animal. What is the halacha? Amrle im eno inyan lahara dichsiv gabe achos ava achoseim. I'm sorry.
You say it can be by a man.
Yeah, correct. And obviously it's shalokadarka. Correct. There's no other way. So it has to be referring to that. So the Gemara, and by the way, the Gemara assumes that when we say that hara works by a woman, that's kedarka and shalokadarka. It's both. So the Gemara says, "Amrle im eno in lahara dichsiv gabe achos ava achos aim da'asya be'keisha mid Rabbi Yona." So if I don't need the hara to teach me the halacha that hara applies by a father's sister and a mother's sister, because it's learned out from the hekesh of Rabbi Yona, tineu inyan lahara de behema, then go ahead and allow it to be used for hara by behema, to teach me that even by behema one is chai for bestiality as soon as what? There's even that partial bia. To which the Gemara says, michti behema chai v'misos bezdin he. Behema is one of those things that is punishable by death of a bezdin. My time a ksiv lahara didei gabe chai v'krisos. So I will say, now here's the shaila. If you're going to tell me now that if tahara over here teaches me that I'm even chayiv hara by behema, bestiality is punishable by misas bezdin. Why does the Torah choose to state it over here by achos aim and achos av, which is a penalty punishable by kares? Meaning, why is it written here? Lichtov gabi misos bezdin. Why don't you write it instead in the section by misos bezdin? V'neilef misas bezdin and misas bezdin. And I would learn out one misas bezdin from another misas bezdin, that in any case of misas bezdin, hara is also problematic. To which the Gemara answers, "Aidi de kulhu kra l'drasha asi." Since the entire pasuk is used for drasha purposes, so ksiv be nami ha milsa l'drasha. Since the entire pasuk is used for drasha purposes, therefore we insert this phrase over here for drasha purposes over here that we're going to learn, that we're going to use to teach us about bestiality, even though again bestiality is a chiyuv misas bezdin, not a chiyuv kares. So my drasha. What's the drasha we use this pasuk for? Disanya ervas achos avicha lo sigala. The pasuk says the erva of your father's sister you shall not reveal, you shall not uncover. Bein mina av, bein mina aim. This is true whether again it's from your father or from your mother. So the Gemara says. Look at Rashi for just a moment. Achos ava achos la mechavi misna. Actually, wrong Rashi. I'm sorry. So whether again this is your father's sister from his mother's father's sister from his father, lemais again you will be chayiv. The Gemara says, "Ata omer bein mina av bein mina aim." You said it's true if it's your father's sister, from either from his father, from his mother. O eino ela mina av v'lo mina aim. Maybe not true. Maybe it's only a prohibition if it's his sister from his father, but not from his mother. To which the Gemara says, "V'lo mina aim v'dinhu chayiv kan v'chayiv ba'achoso." It says that you are chayiv over here and chayiv by your sister ma'achoso, just like by the sister bein mina av bein aim. I will say a person is obligated. A person is liable if you have relations with his sister, whether that is your sister from your father or your sister from your mother. Afkan, so too over here when it comes to the prohibition of a father's sister, it is true, bein what? Bein mina av, bein mina aim. Or the other possibility is what? Chayiv kan v'chayiv bidodaso. It says over here that I'm chayiv here and chayiv with an aunt. Mad dodaso min av. Who is the aunt? The aunt is my father's brother's sister. Father's brother's wife, excuse me. Father's brother's wife, and that is true only when that is only true mina avlo min aim. That is only true with my father. With my father, who what? With my my uncle, who is the brother of my father from their father. V'lo min ha'em, but not if they're just maternal brothers. So the Gemara says, "Avkan mina av v'lo min ha'em." So too maybe over here in the case of father's sister, that only applies to a sister from his father, not from his mother. So the Gemara says, "Nira lemi dome donin." So we want to compare things that are similar. So therefore we will say, "Isser haba me'elav me'isser haba me'elav." So we'll go ahead and we'll compare two isurim that occur on their own, that are kind of de facto isurim, va'al tochiach dodaso, and you can't go ahead and compare it to the case of the brother's wife, she'ein isser haba me'elav. Rabbi said that is not a de facto isser. That's only a result of what? That's only a result, ultimately, again, of the uncle making a decision to marry this woman. I mean, Rabbi said, let's say the prohibition of a father's sister, that is a de facto prohibition. Once he's my father, then by definition, I'm asura to his. That already exists, as opposed to dodosa, the case of the aunt, which is not de facto. That only occurred because the brother chose to marry her. So, or the other possibility is this: done in krovia av mikrovia av. We'll go ahead and we'll compare situations of father's relatives to father's relatives. Va'al tochiach achoso shekrove atzmo. And don't go ahead and compare it to the case of a sister, where the sister is a relation to one's self. Talmud Lomar, therefore the pasuk says, Ervas achos avicha lo sigale. The pasuk says that the erva of your father's sister you shall not uncover, bein mina av, bein mina aim. And this is true whether or not it is the sister of your father's maternal sister, or your father's paternal sister, the isser is still the same. Ervas achos imcha lo sigale. Similarly, when the Torah says that the erva of your mother's sister you shall not uncover, bein mina av, bein mina aim. This is true whether or not what? Whether this is your mother's maternal sister or your mother's paternal sister. Lamali lemichtava ba'achos av. Lamli lemichtava ba'achos. And so it seems that the Torah is teaching me the same idea twice. Namely, that a person is chayiv for having relations with his parent's sister, whether that is my parent's sister, a paternal sister, or a maternal sister. Why do I need both? To which the Gemara says, you need them both. Why? I would have thought like this. Generally, so familial realities or familial frameworks are created from the father, right? From a patrilineal perspective. So I might have thought again, it's only the father's family that matters. However, again, maybe from the mother's side, again, the relationships are not as important, meaning halachically for erva purposes. Or if it would have just written it, therefore the Torah has to teach me that it applies to the mother also, teaching that even by the mother's family, I'm still chayiv. If it would have just said by the mother's family, I would have said like this: what? Shekin vadois. As opposed to, we spoke about this before. Out of both of your parents, the only one you know with absolute certainty is your real parent, is your mother, right? How do I know that my father is my father? How do I really know that? So I know that because he's the man that lives with my mother, and the statistical probability is that even if the mother had relations with another man, the reality is the statistical probability is still that my father is my father. It's like a good Father's Day card, right? Like Happy Father's Day, probably, right? Statistically speaking, thank you for being my father. So the idea is, I might have thought that lemaisa what I would have just said that the prohibition is on the mother's sister. I might have thought again because I know my mother is my mother. That's a vadai. Aval achos av, but again from my father's side, emalo. I might have thought that again lemaisa. Maybe I'm not prohibited to his sister because lemaisa again. Really, I only know my father is my father through chazaka or through rov. But can I say with absolute certainty? Again, now of course we have tests that could determine that. But can I say with absolute certainty that he's my father? Maybe not. Therefore tzricha. Therefore I need both cases. Therefore I need the prohibition of achos aim and achos av. Vido daso de pshita letana de mina av lo mina aim minale. And in the case, ultimately, again, of the aunt, meaning my father's brother's wife, that the Tana understands that it only refers to the father's brother and not to the mother's brother's wife. Where do I know that from? Amarava asye dodo. We can make a gzir of dodo. Ksiv hacha ervas dodo gila. It says over here, the erva of his aunt, he has uncovered, uksiv hasam, o dodo, o ben dodo yiga alenu. Either his uncle or the son of his uncle will be redeemed. That's talking about if a family member was sold off into captivity, into servitude. I shouldn't say captivity, servitude. Malahalan mina'av, just like over here, ododo ben dodo means by the father's side. Velo mina'im, afka mina'av, velo mina'im. V'hasa minalan. How do we know over there that in the case of when somebody's sold into servitude, that is dafka, if it's a member of the father's family, there's an obligation to redeem them. Amar Krak, as the pasuk says, mi mishpachto yiga'alenu. From the family he shall be redeemed. Mishpachas av karuya mishpacha. It is the family of the father that is called mishpacha. Mishpachas aim ina karuya mishpacha. Now I will say, now what does this mean? Don't try to use this for getting out of like things with your in-laws, right? But rather what this means over here is like this. What this means is from a halachic perspective, we know that it is the father's family that establishes identity, establishes Judaic identity. Therefore, whenever the Torah just uses the word mishpacha in an unqualified sense, that always refers to what? That always refers to father's family. So therefore, again, lemaisa, what comes out is the following. Lemaisa, what comes out over here is that we see that halacha lemaisa. So again, so let's bring this all together. So first of all, let me read to you. So actually, we're going to stop over here in this piece, even though this is the middle of the sugya. So what's come out over here is like this: we've established that that the partial bia is going to be usher in all cases of arayos, in all cases of forbidden relationships. So ultimately, again, the partial bia will create an isser. Not only that, but we've established that is true also with mishkav zachar. And we've also established that is true with bestiality. What we've also established is that lemaisa, all of the additional psukim that we were going to originally use to teach us about hara were necessary for all kinds of other purposes. We've repurposed them for all different kinds of drashos. There was one also very important thing that we started off with today, which I just want to show you the Rambam. So how do we pass in terms of the first part, in terms of what affects Yibum, what doesn't affect Yibum, to which the Gemara answers, Haba, to which the Rambam answers, this is in Parak Beis of Hilchos Yibum Chalitza, Haba'a Yevimto, Bein b'mezid, bein ba'onis, bein b'ratzon, bein shehu mezid, bein shehu shogeg, o anusa, o shaisa himazida, v'hu shogeg, o arnos, o shaisa yeshena, bein shaisa ira, o shkam b'darka, shaloki darka, echad ha'ma'ara, ve'echad ha'gomer kana. Rabbi says Yibum is affected in any way that bia occurs. Irrespective of the intentions of the parties, Yibum is affected, whether it's full bia or whether it's just hara. Yibum is affected with one important caveat: b'medar murim sheniskavein livol. As long as there was an intent for bia. Aval nafal min agag v'niskaba, o sheba'aleh shikr, she'eno makir klum, o yashin lokana. But if there was no intention for bia, he fell off the roof, and bia happened, or he was shikr and didn't realize what he was doing, or he was sleeping and bia occurred. In all of those cases, yibum does not occur. Similarly, again, niskavi la'atiach b'kosel v'hitiach b'yivim dalokana. If he again became aroused because of the wall, but then had relations with her, that's not called Yibum. However, again, la'atiach bebehema v'atiach b'yavimto kana sharnis kavin l'shum be'ilam mikamakom. But again, if he had intentions for bestiality, and that ended up having relations with the Yevama, then that lemais again will affect bia. So halacha lemais, what the Rambam paskins is, bia can be affected, Yibum could be affected in any case, as long as there was kavana for bia, even if it wasn't for the right bia. But nevertheless, as long as there was kavana for bia, it could affect Yibum. But if there was a lack of kavana, which would come up again most acutely in the cases of shichrus, drunkenness, or in the case where he's asleep, the Lamaisi Yibum is not affected under those circumstances. All right, the Lord said we'll stop over here. Yeah.
Tomorrow, Chakras is at the regular time, 6:45. Daf Yomi follows Chakras tomorrow at approximately 7:20.